Well, it's certainly interesting. This is the second day where we have had significant protests in the main city, Yangon. Though last week it was weekdays, obviously. It was early days. People were shocked, but they weren't on the streets in the way that they are now. So there's certainly the potential in big cities like Yangon, Mandalay, where people can spread by word of mouth news of protests and what they're doing. There's certainly the potential this could backfire and this could see people taking to the streets. But also the now opposition to the military regime, they are very worried. They're very worried because, their organization, their way of getting the message across the country and to people outside the country has been badly hit. And they're also very worried that with a semi-blackout in place, that, the military could take some very sharp retributions against them. We're already seeing an increase in arrests. People are telling me that they're, fearful of knocks on the door in the middle of the night. So, it's a big fear for the anti-regime people to have no access to these common forms of communication.
And without them able to get their message across, that obviously leaves a possibility for disinformation. Has the army tried to craft a narrative about these protesters? The army is actually trying to, in public profile, is trying to ignore these protesters. Their state media and the global New Light of Myanmar newspaper are not mentioning them. What they're trying to do is portray a sense of normalcy. They are sort of holding cabinet meetings with their new appointees. The army general who headed the coup held a meeting of the new ruling council. They've been calling diplomats and sort of explains to them why the old government was responsible for electoral fraud and wasn't running the country very well. This can't really continue, and it's in an alternative reality where they're sort of saying that we are maintaining this country on the road to a multi-party democracy, they said, by planning to hold a future election. But at the moment, they're not so much vilifying the opposition as they are trying to ignore them. But when you see the numbers on the streets, that's just simply not a tenable position.
Clashes between the opposition and security forces right next to the presidential palace. It's become a regular occurrence on the streets of Port-au-Prince. Protesters continue to demand President Jovenel Moïse steps down.
It's a strike against kidnapping, against hunger in the country, and we are sending a clear message to the president to respect the Constitution.
Earlier this week, transport unions and other workers went on a 2-day strike denouncing institutional violence and an alarming rise in kidnappings. Human rights groups say at least 1,000 people were kidnapped in 2020.
When someone is kidnapped, the person must go to the street and ask for Jovenel Moïse to give him security. That's the reason why we organized 2 days of lockout to show Jovenel Moïse that we can't accept this situation, But as soon as the lockout finished, the kidnapping restart quickly.
Haiti's opposition says it's time for Moïse to go. They say his mandate ends this Sunday. But Moïse disagrees. He says his 5-year term began when he was sworn in 2017, and that he still has 1 year in power. But members of the opposition say Moïse's term began in 2016 in the wake of chaotic elections. And while the political crisis deepens, Haiti's economy continues to deteriorate. Economists like Camille Charlemers says urgent action is needed.
The amount of people going hungry in the country has doubled. It's gone from 2 million to 4 million people. The currency is devaluated and there's an inflation rate close to 25%.
To complicate matters, legislative elections were postponed when parliamentary terms expired. This past year, President Moïse has been ruling Haiti by decree. The U.S. and the Organization of American States have urged new legislative elections to restore the balance of power. Moïse is proposing a referendum in April to reform the constitution.
Last week, we held a major meeting with all entities, including the UN, the Provisional Electoral Council, the Advisory Committee, the government, the police chief, the Prime Minister. We had a big talk about security issues, elections, and the referendum. We were clear with all these people on April 25th because it will be a victory date for us.
But the opposition says it's another excuse to hold on to power. And that's why they vow to continue pressuring the government on the streets. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera.
Chants of freedom rang in central Tunis as thousands defied lockdown and took to the streets, clashing with riot police as they voiced their anger on a compound of issues, including police violence against thousands arrested in the past 2 weeks.
اليوم الحريات مهددة. أنا نذكر كنت موجود في التحركات في السنوات هذه كل بعد الثورة عمره ما صار خناق على التحركات على الاحتجاجات كما توا.
The rallies began last month with protesters demanding government action on the ongoing economic woes in the country. A decade after the 2011 Tunisian revolution, many are still angered by those in power, who they say aren't doing enough to improve living conditions in the country.
On est là parce qu'on en a marre. Parce qu'on en a marre de la corruption, on en a marre du vol, on en a marre de cette pseudo-élite politique qui ne fait que corrompre le pays, nous voler, arrêter les jeunes, les maltraiter.
During the march, Tunisians also paid tribute to Chokri Belaid, a left-wing activist killed outside his home in 2013, an assassination that had then plunged the country into political crisis.
Libya's rival military committees have been meeting in the city of Sirte for the last 3 days. The meetings, facilitated by the UN, have played a critical role in the success of this week's talks in Switzerland. A nationwide ceasefire was agreed last October in Geneva, which stipulated that all foreign fighters should leave the country within 3 months. But the fighters have failed to withdraw by the January 24th deadline. And the deal also called for the main roads between eastern and western Libya to reopen. A member of the Joint Military Committee says that will happen once they remove landmines from the area.
We agreed on opening the road between east and west, and we have agreed to start the process of clearing mines through the specialist teams that will start their work on February the 10th and end on February the 25th.
The UN Security Council has requested the Secretary General to establish and deploy a team to Libya to monitor the ceasefire.
It's essential that all foreign fighters and mercenaries move first to Tripoli and Benghazi and then leave the country, according to the new schedule that was defined. And it is essential that everybody cooperates with the new authorities to make peace happen in Libya.
According to the UN support mission, there are more than 20,000 foreign fighters in Libya, with an estimated 2,000 Russian mercenaries. Moscow was one of warlord Khalifa Haftar's biggest supporters in his 14-month failed military campaign to take control of the capital, Tripoli. The U.S. Africa Command has said Russia flew fourth-generation jet fighters into Libya, with neither Haftar's forces nor private military companies having the ability to arm, operate, and sustain the jets without state support. The jets are believed to be based in the El Jufra Air Base in central Libya.
We agreed to send a letter to the Security Council demanding that countries that have mercenaries and forces on the ground must be removed immediately.
On Friday, Libya's rival factions agreed to form a new transitional government that will lead the country until elections in December. Libya's new unified government has received international praise and support, but the road ahead is filled with many challenges. Forcing foreign fighters out of the country will perhaps be the most daunting task, but without doing that, it could be difficult to hold a nationwide election come December. Malik Traina, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Anger in the Chilean capital over the police shooting of a young street performer. Police used water cannon as hundreds took to the streets in Santiago. They banged pots and charged at officers. The protesters wanted to show solidarity with 27-year-old Francisco Martinez Romero, who was shot dead by police on Friday. Officers say they opened fire because the juggler refused to cooperate in a routine search. The government held an emergency meeting while a judge has ordered an investigation into the shooting.
We always regret that an operation of these characteristics result in the death of a person. As a government, we want to guarantee that all measures will be taken to ensure the justice system and the prosecutor's office can investigate exactly what happened.
The file for justice came after demonstrators set several public buildings on fire in the normally sleepy town of Panjipui. Residents say police brutality must come to an end.
I believe that the protocols and the actions of the police must be reviewed. Yes, it's not the first time or the second nor the third time.
We must have justice because something like this cannot go unpunished. It cannot. They always wash their hands saying it wasn't self-defense. No, things cannot stay this way. It cannot.
Mass anti-government protests since 2019 have put Chile's police force under intense scrutiny, with local and international watchdogs alleging excessive use of force and human rights violations.
It's always been like this in the last couple of decades because the police institution has never really been reformed. There's a lot of human rights violations, a lot of repression by the Chilean police going on in the shanty towns near the capital, in the smaller neighborhoods, the poorer neighborhoods, which we never hear of.
While those living in Panguipulli mourn the death of the young street performer, not many are hopeful it would bring what they say is the much-needed police accountability. Emily Sue, Al Jazeera.
It's the third day of waiting for Lemlem Mekonnen to be registered at this refugee camp in Sudan's Gadaref state. She wants to be able to receive her own shelter. The camp, known as NASEEBA, is her second new home since she escaped fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray region weeks ago.
I was in a different camp before. Things were tough there to the extent that I thought of returning back to Ethiopia, but I was told by those arriving that it was still not safe to return and that the fighting is ongoing, so I agreed to be transferred here.
The camp, which opened in early January, now hosts more than 13,000 Ethiopian refugees. They fled their homes because of fighting between the government and the Regional Tigray People's Liberation Front. It started in early November and has left the region with little to no way to communicate. Aid agencies say humanitarian access to many parts of Tigray have also been restricted. NASEEBA camp is the second open to host the refugees who've been relocated from other camps that were closer to the Sudan-Ethiopia border.
Refugees continue to arrive, though in lesser numbers than at the start of the conflict. The reception centers which served as camps in Kassala and Gadaref were not meant to be camps because, for the safety of the refugees, a camp has to be at least 50 kilometers away from the international border. So we're working to bring those still there, here, to be able to give them protection and services.
More than 60,000 have arrived in Sudan since the start of the conflict. The Ethiopian government says this is a law enforcement operation. Its soldiers captured the Tigrayan capital, Mekelle, in December. Most of the refugees here have been in camps for nearly 3 months now, arriving just days after the start of the Ethiopian government offensive in Tigray. Others arrived more recently, but the rise in the number of refugees coming to Sudan, despite some reporting that Ethiopian soldiers have made it difficult to cross the border, is an indication that the conflict in Tigray is not over. And with the continuing flow of refugees, aid organizations say their appeal for funding to respond to the situation is only half met.
We have a country interagency appeal, which requires around 147 million US dollars to be able to assist up to 100,000 refugees. This doesn't mean that we have already 100,000 refugees here, nor that they will arrive, all of them, but we need to be prepared and planning for that scenario.
More refugees are expected here in the coming days and weeks. While many say they prefer NASEEBA camp to the reception centers they were at earlier, they say what they really want is the ability to return home. Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera, NASEEBA camp, Gadaref State.
These families left Venezuela hoping for a new life in Chile. Back home, life had become unbearable. They say there's no food, no jobs, and no future.
You can't survive in Venezuela. You really can't. How are we supposed to make it with about $3 a month?
Now there are fears of a potential humanitarian crisis. Entire communities are walking towards the Chilean border, climbing mountains and rocky grounds to avoid border checkpoints. At least 2 people died attempting the journey, one from Colombia, the other from Venezuela.
About 30 people who were in the group tried to help one of the migrants with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it's possible the patient had COVID-19, so now there's a risk the virus is spread.
More than 4 million people have fled Venezuela in recent years. Most went to Colombia and Peru, but now more families are choosing to go to prosperous Chile. But not everyone is happy to see them.
Actualmente, los aymaras de ambos países.
Families from our local Aymaras indigenous group have had intruders in their properties. They walk in, looking for food and clothes. They go through Peru and they arrive to Chile in deplorable conditions.
Chilean soldiers have been deployed along Bolivia's border to prevent illegal crossings, but stopping them has been a challenge. Most refugees and migrants say their desire for a new start is stronger than the fear of the dangerous journey. Katia Lopez-Odoyan, Al Jazeera.
Sarah, who doesn't want to use her real name, was diagnosed with COVID-19 and pneumonia in January. She was admitted to hospital when she could not breathe properly, and without the hospital's knowledge, began using a drug called ivermectin.
They organized the ivermectin for me, and then it had to be basically smuggled into the hospital, which I felt is so unjust because this is something that's going to help people. It's something that people need. It's something that it shouldn't be seen as a criminal event for you to try and save your loved one. You know, at that point when you're at the point of death, you will do anything.
Sarah is so convinced the drug saved her life, she also gave it to her parents, who had also tested positive for COVID-19. They all used the drug without medical supervision. Ivermectin is not registered in South Africa for human consumption. Until now, it's been used to treat animals for things like parasites. But its popularity and illegal use has forced South Africa's Health Products Authority to allow what it's calling controlled use of the medicine, and in this way monitor its use.
Think about it. It's an 8-page form which you have to fill in online each time you have a patient. It takes an hour to fill in the form.
The requirements to use ivermectin have since been relaxed. Now doctors can use the drug on COVID-19 patients while they wait for approval. But there are concerns the regulations and delays will only fuel the black market rather than control the drug's use. This is the second police bust of ivermectin tablets being smuggled into South Africa in recent weeks. Here, more than 300,000 tablets were brought in illegally from abroad. Authorities are worried the unregulated use of ivermectin could lead to an overdose and say there's no clear evidence the drug works.
Their biggest concern is the unauthorized use and the fact that there's been a growing black market through which the drug is imported. And the concern here is that ivermectin is not necessarily safe to use.
Overdosing on the drug can cause blindness, neurological effects, and liver damage. Globally, at least 5 countries want to use ivermectin to treat COVID-19, including India and Argentina. South Africa plans to begin clinical trials on the effectiveness of ivermectin to treat COVID-19. But that may be of little interest to those desperate to get their hands on the drug, which they believe saves lives. FAHMIDA Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg.
A painstaking scientific investigation is underway on British soil. Researchers are trying to hunt down the latest mutation of coronavirus. So far, tests show that 11 people have contracted the newest mutation out of 214,000 positive coronavirus cases. This latest mutation shares genetic information that has also been seen in both the South African and Brazilian variants. But is there reason to worry? The answer is not quite. All viruses mutate. The first UK variant was shown to be more contagious. This second mutation shares that characteristic, but it may also cause the immune system's antibodies to be less effective in the case of reinfection, a concern for this disease expert.
Ce qu'on a vu, c'est qu'il y a une proximité à la fois avec le variant sud-africain, quand on regarde un petit peu le génome de ce variant du variant, mais également avec le brésilien, ce qui est peut-être plus inquiétant. On a vu à Manaus, si vous voulez, des gens qui étaient très proches de l'immunité collective. Il y a une réinfection extrêmement importante.
So will vaccines work as well against newer strains? Although the level of protection won't be as high, it will still be enough, according to researchers.
Ce qui est rassurant avec les vaccins pour lesquels on a déjà des données de ce point de vue-là, c'est que le taux d'anticorps neutralisants, donc les anticorps clés, sont très élevés. Et donc même si on a une réduction plus ou moins forte quand on est confronté à ces variants, le taux d'anticorps reste suffisamment fort pour qu'on soit très rassuré.
What's more, both Pfizer and Moderna say their mRNA vaccines could easily be adapted to fight newer strains of the virus.
A German army medical team has arrived in Lisbon as Portugal struggles in the face of soaring coronavirus infections. The team is set to be deployed to an intensive care unit, underscoring an acute shortage of human resources in Portugal's public health system. Portugal is currently the world's worst hit country by size of population.
Medical support team consists of 8 doctors and 18 nurses that are due to work side by side with Portuguese doctors and nurses in a Lisbon hospital, Hospital da Luz, fighting the corona epidemic. They will bring with them substantial medical equipment.
Thanks to this team, who have arrived in our country today, we'll be able to open 8 more intensive care beds. For some, it may seem small, but I guarantee you that it's a lot. It's a lot for a health system that is under great pressure, and the next 15 days will be decisive.
Bodies wrapped in blankets or plastic sheets are left on the floor of cemeteries and funeral homes of the capital La Paz and other hard-hit cities, as Bolivia struggles to deal with the second wave of coronavirus infections, deadlier than the first. Government officials fear the backlog could spark another outbreak, while accusing some funeral homes of taking in more bodies that they can safely handle.
Regional governments should have provided training to funeral homes on how to manage COVID deaths but haven't done so. And secondly, some funeral homes are trying to profit from the increase in deaths. And finally, there is a structural problem regarding the capacity of both public and private cemeteries to fulfill the high demand for cremations and burials.
In Bolivia, one of the poorest countries in Latin America, many cemeteries have stopped accepting the bodies of COVID-19 victims. Some funeral home employees took to the streets, saying they're left with few options.
Since the first wave, we do not have a crematory oven. The central cemetery in El Alto did have one and was receiving COVID bodies, but they're not anymore. We simply don't have anywhere to take these bodies.
There is a similar story in Mexico City, with the government trying to treat COVID patients at home to free up space in hospitals overburdened by a surge of new infections. But finding life-saving oxygen is often a struggle.
At this time in the pandemic, it is very difficult to get an oxygen tank or a concentrator, and then there's a cost because of the demand for them.
All while vaccination rates in Mexico have slowed to a trickle. Pfizer hasn't been able to send in additional doses of its vaccine in 3 weeks, leaving Mexicans who got the first shot to wonder if they will be able to receive a second one in time. And while some countries in the region have started to relax restrictions after a reduction in cases, others are announcing new ones. These are the deserted streets of La Habana, Cuba, where a new night curfew was imposed after a surge following the reopening of airports. It's a back-and-forth battle against the virus that continues to batter this part of the world particularly hard. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera.
When this Nanda Devi glacier broke and crashed into a dam, it resulted in flooding that sent torrents of water downstream with mud and debris damaging homes and a power plant. And those feared dead are believed to have been working at this hydroelectric power project, and also villagers who were roaming around the area, perhaps feeding their cattle or grazing their cattle or collecting firewood. Now, authorities say that several rescue teams are being rushed to the area. The Home Ministry said that India's Air Force is also on being ready to join rescue operations. The floods have prompted, as you mentioned, an evacuation of villages downstream. Prime Minister Narendra Modi tweeted that he is monitoring the situation closely. Northern districts across this region have been put on high alert.
And so, as I mentioned, this area has been hit by devastating floodings in the past. Why does this keep happening in this region?
Well, it's too early to say why this particular disaster happened, but experts have been saying for over years that the increasing number of hydroelectric power projects might be having an impact on the environment there. As you mentioned, those devastating floods in 2013, thousands of lives were lost, roads were blocked, communication destroyed, basically, for days and months. Now, the state has been on a drive to build these hydroelectric power projects, and one of India's main rivers, the Ganga, and its tributaries flow in this area. So experts say these are having an impact on the environment and also causing disasters like this one. In fact, the BJP's own member, Uma Bharati, who was a former water resources minister, tweeted earlier today saying that she had requested that Himalaya, being a very sensitive place, power projects should not be built on the Ganga and its main tributaries. But yes, we'll have to wait for more details to find out exactly what triggered this glacier to break away.
Cautious first steps in the form of a trio of executive orders. Joseph Biden has signed 3 mandates to figure out how to change the U.S.'s immigration policies. The first order of business, helping the some 600 children who still aren't reunited with their parents. Some 2 years after Donald Trump's migrant policy sparked condemnation by Democrats and Republicans alike for its cruelty.
We're going to work to undo the moral and national shame of the previous administration that literally, not figuratively, ripped children from the arms of their families, their mothers and fathers at the border.
Beyond reuniting children with their families, the orders are largely directives to review Trump's immigration agenda. Biden said he isn't creating new laws, but striking down bad policy. First steps that, while praised, also frustrated immigration advocates.
As much as this is very encouraging and we fully support the steps that the administration has taken here, there's got to be some action really quickly on this on the border, because it really is a humanitarian disaster.
Currently, some 65,000 asylum seekers are waiting, often in squalor, in Mexico for U.S. immigration hearings. And the executive order launches a review of Trump's Stay in Mexico program, one that has effectively pushed the problem further south with militarized roadblocks across Central America. Last month, a caravan of Honduran migrants was stopped in Guatemala. Biden's orders also review how best to integrate, possibly through citizenship, 9 million people settled illegally in the U.S. A tempered strategy, one that aims to avoid a rush for the border while also eventually reversing policies.
A new U.S. president and a fresh approach to foreign policy.
America is back. America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
President Joe Biden used his first visit to the State Department on Thursday to lay out his foreign policy objectives. Among them, restoring the U.S.'s role as the world's policeman. Notably, Biden had stern words for Russia and its strongman leader, Vladimir Putin. He called for the immediate release of jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
I made it clear to President Putin, in a manner very different from my predecessor, that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens, are over.
Biden's condemnation of Russia marks a very different tone from former President Donald Trump, who often said he respected the Russian leader and shied away from direct confrontation with him. In a wide-ranging speech, Biden also said that the US would stand up to China's human rights and economic abuses, but vowed cooperation with the country when it was in America's interest. The new administration seems set on rolling back many Trump-era policies, including scrapping Trump's plan to withdraw US troops stationed in Germany and ending support for Saudi Arabia's military offensive in Yemen. The president plans to increase the cap on the number of refugees allowed into the US to more than 8 times the limit under Donald Trump.
It's going to take time to rebuild what has been so badly damaged. This executive order will position us to be able to raise the refugee admissions back up to 125,000 persons for the first full fiscal year of the Biden-Harris administration.
He announced that the US would promote LGBTQI rights around the world as part of an effort to repair the country's moral leadership. After 4 years of a president who snubbed traditional allies and pandered to autocrats, the White House used the visit to symbolically charter a new course for America and its position on the world stage.